Welcome to Spot Check, the weekly video update series for The Greatest Unreality, a dissertation about Dungeons & Dragons. I'm filming this in the Bronx, New York, as I'm here for 2 weeks doing field work. I've been very busy doing interviews, and I'll be able to talk more about those as I start to be able to review them and get transcribed. In anthropology, we talk about when you're out in the field, one of your jobs is just to be a sponge, and you're just soaking all of this up, and you're doing some analysis and thinking about it as you go, but it's really kind of a fire hose. And so there are things that I've got bouncing around in my head from all these conversations. I'm going to mostly hold off on distilling those out and talking to you about them until I can kind of make sense of what I'm going through and getting from these conversations. But I will be giving you bits and pieces here and there over the next couple of videos. So last week we talked about the role of chance in Dungeons & Dragons and in old school games, and how embracing contingency in D&D focuses on how we mythologize those unpredictable elements in life. This week I want to talk about the second of the three things I'd like to look at in relationship to narrativization and everyday life, which would be the embracing of mundane events. And the next one we'll talk about in the final part of this series will be looking at silliness and nonsense in gaming. But when we're looking at embracing the mundane in gaming and in old school D&D, we're looking to the narrative value of immutable facts, even those things that we wouldn't normally consider interesting. So different groups of gamers focus on this to different degrees. Sometimes you're tracking exactly how much your character can carry, how far your light can reach, how long you've been in the dungeon, when your torch burns out, and so on and so forth. But to the extent that these elements are considered, what the players in the game are doing is coming to terms with the mythologization of the mundane details that prove so difficult in our daily life. So like the realistic maps in fantasy fiction at the beginning of the late 19th century, you have this time when in fantasy literature you start getting all of these really realistic maps, and these are modernist trappings. They take the trappings of the modern world and apply them towards fantasy that help take what Michael Saylor calls an as-if stance towards the content, pretending to believe that it's true even though you know that it's not. So the way that D&D deals with the mundane in the old school assumptions is very similar to this, and one gamer has remarked that it's fantasy fiction through actuarial science. And Gygax actually had a little bit of insurance background. So in this sense, the fact that in the similarities with fantasy fiction of the late 19th century, it's not particularly novel. It's a continuation of trends that were started in fantasy a while ago. But when we're dealing with it in gaming, it takes it a step further, because they do enhance the sense of realism in the game. But I want to argue that one of the most important things that they do is to throw up barriers to certain kinds of immersion. So we think of, often people talk about one of the reasons that we play games is to get lost in this other world, this fantasy setting, and to be immersed in that. We talk a lot about immersion, and stopping to have to think about how exactly you're going to carry all that gold can provide a sense of breaking immersion, and that's why a lot of people try not to use it in their games, or they scale it back, or they completely jettison that and think in cinematic terms. But if you look at a game where they are embracing the mundane, instead of looking at it as a failed attempt at immersion, but a successful attempt of something else, we can start to look at what is actually happening when people do that in the game. So the way I'd like to look at that is to think of the fact that D&D is often compared to theater, so where the dungeon master is the director and playwright, and the other players are kind of like improv actors. So there's a lot of problems with that breakdown, but I'm going to follow that and look at a different kind of theater than people normally have in mind when they talk about this, by looking at the theater tradition popularized by Bertolt Brecht. And so in Brechtian theater, the most important feature is that they are trying to exclude from the experience the engendering of illusion. So Brecht would kind of use what were called making strange techniques, like flooding the house with bright lights or breaking the fourth wall, to constantly remind people that what they were watching was a play, and to cause them to reflect on that experience of being in a play. And I would argue that what we're seeing in old school D&D, when we stop and ask the player to calculate how exactly their character is going to carry all that gold, you're seeing a very similar thing where the immersion is intentionally broken and the player has to shift out of one mode and think in another mode, and that shifting back and forth is one of the main features we see in old school D&D if you look at the experience. And that constantly challenges the immersion and causes the player to reflect on that shifting back and forth, or can cause them to reflect, I should say. Now, D&D actually goes a step further than when people do this in cinema. You can look at a director like Godard, who introduces protagonists with showing the cutboard and the cameraman, but not, as sociologist Erving Goffman points out, the cutboard and the cameraman behind the one shown. So you have a cameraman filming a cameraman, but you never see the original cameraman. When we look at the mundane in Dungeons and Dragons and see and kind of break that enchantment to look at it, the entire artifice of enchantment is laid bare, which is something that, at least according to Goffman, similar approaches in cinema never accomplish. And so part of what we see, in summary, with the use of the mundane in Dungeons and Dragons is it constantly causes the players to shift modes of experience from an immersive state, which may be experienced only fleetingly in old school D&D because the whole system isn't built towards that. It's built towards something else. And that's part of what we want to look at, is what is it built to do. And so shifting from that immersive state that might be experienced fleetingly into sort of a logistics mode where you've broken that enchantment and you have to calculate how many gold pieces you can carry, and maybe on a social level also try and negotiate who's going to carry what and work that amount among the players, and then shifting back down into the immersive level. So you see in D&D a constant shifting back and forth between these levels, and that helps think about and lay bare the process of mythologization, where narrative details emerge out of mundane contexts, and mundane contexts emerge out of narrative details. That's all the time I have for today, so thanks for listening. Next week, we'll be talking about the role of silliness in the narrativization process, and I will also be sharing some of the stories and things I've been thinking about from this fieldwork that I'm in the midst of right now. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next week.